Good morning, subscribers, and welcome to what will be my final video probably of 2018. And I'd like to end it with my second in this new series of the reviews of the business pages from the Sunday Times. So I've got 3 copies here in front of me. Not too many articles to go through, so it'll probably be a shorter video than my previous one. And I'd like to just send you on your way, ladies and gentlemen, for the Christmas break. Hopefully with a few gems of articles ringing in your ears. So without further ado, let's get to it. So the first one is from December the 2nd, and really I'm just going to very quickly jump straight to one article in particular, in this particular edition, and it is to do with Mr. Steve Hewitt. Now, Mr. Steve Hewitt, recently appointed as the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer of Gymshark. And when I mentioned this to my students yesterday, many of them, in fact probably most of them, they all knew of Gymshark, but primarily because of its athleisure wear advertisements via social media, particularly via Instagram. And when I was reading this and sharing this with my students, we were looking at this little synopsis here of the life of Steve Hewitt. And we were particularly drawn, of course, by the fact that Mr. Steve Hewitt is actually from just down the road from where I'm seated at the moment, from a little place called Blaydon. Actually went to a school nearby, St Thomas More, a very good school in the local area. And has had a very interesting career, working abroad and now coming back to the UK to head up the operations of Steve Hewitt. And the whole, the operations of Gymshark. And the whole Gymshark story is a very interesting one for those of you who are maybe just about to embark upon your university studies. Set up by 2 very young guys, and now they are turning over somewhere in the region of £200 million a year. So really going from strength to strength. Just reading here, they've got a 32,000 square feet office in Solihull. So things really looking up, and it's amazing, isn't it, that an athleisure wear company can come in and make a dent where you would think maybe that's going to be very competitive and probably very almost impossible to get into a market dominated by the likes of the big brands such as Adidas and Nike and so on. So yeah, really interesting article, that not only from a business point of view but just from a sort of local interest point of view as well. So that's that one, ladies and gentlemen. And that then takes me swiftly on to the edition from December 9th. So there are a few interesting articles in this one, which I'll just very quickly run by you. So the first one is the front page article here, and it says, Bond markets signal the end of the bull run for shares. Now, of course, the Great Recession, as it's fondly or not so fondly known, 2008, some 10 years ago. And as we know, studying economics, these things tend to come and go in cycles, don't they? Boom, recession, recovery, boom, recession, recovery. And this article is looking to the future and saying, well, when is it likely that the next recession might be, and are there any particular indicators in the economy that suggest it's going to be sooner rather than later? And it's talking here about the end of a decade-long bull run. Now, those of you who know your stocks and shares, and we've talked about this in class, the bull run is a rampantly accelerating FTSE, for example. And it might be the case, they're suggesting here in this particular article by Tommy Stubbington, great writer in the Sunday Times, that maybe this bull run is coming to an end. And indeed this morning I see in the news that subsequent to Jerome Powell's increase of the federal base rate yesterday, the stocks and shares in the US have taken a right old hit through the night. But anyways, Tom Stubbington's reckoning that maybe we've had the end of a decade-long run of a bull run, and we'll have recession in the next 12 to 18 months. So that's certainly food for thought, ladies and gentlemen. The next article of particular interest, especially for those of you studying A-level economics, in your microanalysis, particularly when we're looking at competitive markets, you may need to consider and have some knowledge of transport markets. And there's a great article here about the railway industry. very important that you know the setup of the railway industry with Network Rail and the train operating companies, and just talking about yesterday actually the open access arrangements for other competitors to try and get into the railway industry. But this particular article is talking about pensions and pension deficits. And it's a bit of a legacy of the privatisation of the railway industry, that in the same way that British Home Stores, Sir Peter Green, they found that there was an enormous hole in the pension fund. Same thing applies here. And they're talking about the fact that when train operating companies are offered these franchises for 10 and 15 years, because that's fairly short term, there's no incentive for the train operating company, be that Virgin or another operator, to actually top up the pension pot. And so it's an interesting quandary, isn't it, as to, well, how do you make the railway industry more competitive? So they've, rather than giving 5-year contracts, they've extended the length of them to try and get more investment into the railway industry. And again, you need to encourage these firms to invest in the pensions, but again, 15 years, relatively short time period, and so whether they'll be able to plug this hole, which is what the article's questioning, is another matter. So it's an interesting one, that, just with regard to maybe a sort of a disadvantage of privatisation in the railway industry. Moving on, another interesting article here. So this, thinking back a few years ago, this is about Glencore, which is the world's largest, I believe, commodities trading company. And it's talking about the fact that when it merged with another enormous mining company, Xstrata, in 2013, which is a great example of integration, forwards and backwards integration towards the market in that respect, to become this sort of absolute behemoth in the market. And it's just talking about the fact that the chief executive, Ivan Glasenberg, is looking to the future and really pointing out that they have a real dominance and monopoly in copper and cobalt mines, and apparently, unbeknown to me, but that's really essential for electric vehicles, and so it looks like they're very well set for the future if indeed the whole electric vehicles, be that cars and motorcycles and all sorts, if that really takes off, then they're in A1 position to take advantage of that. And I think that's it in this particular edition. Yeah, I think so. And then finally, ladies and gentlemen, so now this brings us up to the Sunday gone, the 16th of December. And a couple of interesting articles here for you. Just one with regard to student loans, really. Those of you who are embarking on your university studies and tuition and so on, you'll know obviously the whole setup for borrowing your monies in order to pay for your fees and living costs and so on and so forth. And this is talking about Tommy Stubbington again, great, as I keep saying, great writer here. He mentions this term fiscal illusion with regard to student debt, because student debt has now ballooned to the tune of 100 billion. And of course that's being just stumped up by and underwritten by the government, the Treasury all the time. And at the moment, or certainly until very recently, student debt has been treated like any other loan on a balance sheet, on a company's balance sheet, in the sense that it's an asset. Because of course that brings in a stream and a steady flow of money. But as you well know, I'm sure, from maybe your watching of the news media this week, you'll have seen that is no longer being the case. And because at the end of the day, the taxpayers are going to have to stump the monies up for this, this has been considered to be misleading and really rather flattering to official borrowing figures. And so I believe on Tuesday or something, 12 or 16 billion of this was added to the budget deficit to try and account, at least in part, for a lot of this money, which of course at the end of the day, much of it will not be paid back anyway, because you only pay a proportion of it back dependent upon your earnings. So it's an interesting one. And then another great article, again, ladies and gentlemen, those of you who are looking at transport, competitive markets, this article is called Off the Rails by Mr. John Collingridge. And if you're looking at supply side policies, again, this is to do with Crossrail and the building of what's going to be called the Elizabeth Line in London. Now, you may know that this has just been, it's been delayed and delayed and delayed and delayed. They reckon now that the opening on December 2019 is also going to be very unrealistic, and it's proving to be slightly, it's becoming a little bit embarrassing, this. If it wasn't for Brexits and backstops, maybe we might hear a little bit more about this, and you stupid woman and all that sort of thing, you might hear a little bit more about this. So, this is Europe's biggest and largest infrastructure project. But given that this is a sort of predecessor to HS2 and all of these sort of extensions and add-ons to HS2 which are going to come in the future, the question being raised here by John Collingridge in part is, can the UK government actually be relied upon to work in partnership with other private companies to deliver these enormous infrastructure projects, which undoubtedly the UK economy needs if we're going to be a force in the future, a force to be reckoned with, but it is becoming slightly embarrassing and, as John says there in his article, going off the rails. And then a final, this is just an interesting article here. So this is at the back. They always look into the finances of a famous person, and the famous person in this case is Mel B from the Spice Girls, who has frittered away in her time £80 million. Remarkable, and no wonder that this, she's all for a Spice Girls reunion tour in order to rebuild the depleted expenses. Talks about the fact that she's having to pay out enormous sums as part of divorce settlements, 1.5 million over 3 years, $40,000 a month spousal support, £350,000 of his legal fees. So, just an interesting one that I grew up in a generation when sort of Spice Girls were at their prime. I'm not sure if I'd really go and see a Spice Girls tour now, but personal preference, obviously. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that brings me to the end. So, without further ado, that just leaves me to wish you all a very Merry Christmas. My students, obviously you've got your trial exams immediately upon, indeed economics is the first exam when we return after the break. So have a restful holiday, but also make sure that you do some work as well. Bye for now.